Hello there. Welcome back to our little video sessions together. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of bias, which we're going to be spending the next few days or a week or so on here together. So by the end of this little video, you should be able to define or explain what bias is. I'll be giving you that definition in just a minute. And be able to recognize and detect the examples of bias when you come across them and find them in a variety of different places in your life. So before we get started too much, I just want you to take a minute and think about each of these sentence starters that I've given you, and think about how you would complete each sentence. What would you say about lawyers, babies, snow, the elderly, so on and so forth? Whether you realize it or not, the way you complete these sentences probably shows your personal bias. Everybody has bias. For instance, some people might complete that first sentence about lawyers by saying that lawyers are liars. Other people might think of lawyers and say that lawyers are very intelligent. Each of these ways of ending the sentence shows the speaker's biases. One is biased in a positive direction and one is biased in a negative direction, but it shows their feelings and opinions about lawyers, and that's really what bias is all about. So what is bias? It's the presence of a positive or negative approach towards a topic. And because of this positive or negative feeling, one or the other, it makes the information presented unbalanced and unfair. So the audience does not get a full, fair picture of all the information because it's leaned towards one side or the other. The author's opinion is included. In other words, bias means that you're presenting the information in such a way that the audience only gets one side or one view of the topic. It is clouded by your opinion and your beliefs. So let's think for just a second about what makes something biased and what is not biased. This first sentence here is an example of something that is not biased. It's just an observation, an objective observation. And that word objective means that it's fair. It's not biased. It's just an observation about Frank, who spends his money very cautiously or carefully. Now, we could talk about Frank's careful spending in a positive bias by saying that Frank is thrifty, a word that's usually associated with being very careful with money in a good way. Or we could talk about Frank in a way that's biased negatively by calling him a cheapskate. So language matters. The way that we're choosing to talk about Frank, even though we're saying all the same thing with each of these three sentences, the words that we're choosing to use about Frank demonstrates our opinions, whether we lean positively or negatively toward Frank and his actions of spending his money. There's many ways that bias can occur and be observed in life. The first one has to do with treatment. A lot of times people are treated differently because of others' biases. For instance, the first one on the list here is age. You as a teenager might experience a different kind of treatment because other people have biases about teenagers. They have positive views or negative views about your age group and the people in it, and therefore that results in different treatment. You could treat people differently and have a bias based on their belief system, a disability, their ethnicity, gender, marital status, national origin, political beliefs, race, religion, and the list could go on and on. Oftentimes our biases results in behaviors that we have towards people that demonstrate how we feel about them, positively or negatively. For instance, a negative bias might result in avoiding certain people or certain groups of people. Oftentimes, jokes that are based on certain stereotypes, like racial jokes, which are inappropriate, or blonde jokes, these are based on people's biases towards those groups of individuals. People might not hire someone because of an age or because of a gender, or on the reverse side, if you have a favorable bias or a positive bias toward a particular group of people, it might mean that they have an advantage in the hiring process of your particular company. So any of these things could potentially be behaviors based on bias. Politics is a really big place where bias is found. During the civil rights movement, there was a lot of accusations that the television and film companies supported mixing races. They supported desegregation and integration of the races. And there was a lot of southern states that refused to let those networks air shows on their cable waves because they disagreed with the opinion that those networks were sharing in their biased coverage. Very early in our country's history, laws were passed that made it illegal for newspapers to publish anything that was negative towards the government, including going against any law or presidential act. And that certainly resulted in bias in the media because the newspapers couldn't report fairly on what was going on. They had to put a positive spin on everything, which resulted in a positive bias. Even today, we still have bias in politics. You might see different newspapers or media sources providing very unfair coverage of some of the political candidates out there. Certain sources are definitely supporters of one candidate or one party, and they'll choose to focus on the positive aspects of that party or that candidate while focusing only on the negatives of the opposition. And it can happen on both sides and with both parties, depending on which media source you choose to watch or read. As we saw earlier, word choice really matters in bias. So the way that you choose your words and the types of words that you choose can really influence the opinion that's projected in what you're saying. The words and tones the journalist uses can often influence a story that you're watching. You can use positive or negative words to change how the audience feels about the news story. Think back to Frank. By calling Frank thrifty, our audience had one view of him, that he is careful with money but in a good way, versus calling Frank a cheapskate. That resulted in a much different view of Frank, where you may not like Frank so much because of his cheapskate tendencies. So language really matters. And this goes back to that connotation that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Choosing the words that have the right kind of emotions attached to them and the right kind of connotations to make sure that you're getting across the right message to the audience that you want them to hear. Here's just some additional examples of bias in word choice. Calling a plan well thought out and intelligent certainly gives it one kind of spin. Calling it shoddy and disorganized, I would not vote for a politician whose plan was described as being shoddy and disorganized. So right away, whatever media source says this has prejudiced me against that politician. They have shared their negative bias with me, and now I have negative feelings towards that politician, and that's not always a good thing when we can be influenced by the media that way. And that's why it's important to be able to detect bias in the news. Everything that you read and everything that you see is affected by the thoughts, the opinions, and the background of all the people who are involved in that project. The interviewers, reporters, photographers, and editors. So when you're reading things in the news or watching things in the media, you need to be constantly thinking about where this story is coming from. What do these people have to gain or lose by talking about things in a positive or negative way, and be constantly thinking about what those thoughts and opinions might be that are influencing your story. You want to form your own opinion. You don't want to just copycat the opinion that the media wants you to have. So that's why it's very important to be aware of bias and be able to find it and recognize it when you're reading and watching the media in our society today. We're going to continue to work on bias and practice with some bias activities over the next few days, but for right now, there's an assignment for you on Google Forms. There's a link to it on the website, the same place where you access this video. Go ahead and complete the short little assignment just to show me that you watched the video and that you were able to complete those two objectives we talked about in the beginning, that you can explain what bias is and you can recognize that something is biased when it's presented to you. Make sure that you do this before class in order to earn your homework points. See you in class.